Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayechi. Jacob, upon his reunion with Joseph, exclaims, Lo palalti. I had never imagined. He had never imagined that he would see his son again. The word he uses for imagining, palalti, is the same word we use for praying, lehitpalel, and for prayer, tfilah. So join us as we imagine what prayer would be as a form of imagining. Join us for imaginary prayer. Well, welcome, Rabbi Mintz. You and I are both headed to the Middle East. You're going to be in Dubai next week, and I will, please God, be in Israel. So this is a Bon Voyage podcast, but welcome to...
and the end of the book of Genesis, so it's perfect.
It is perfect. So I think about 2 podcasts ago, I did it on body language. I really talked about prayer and what, if any, aspect of physical movement could be a part of Jewish prayer. And today, as you could tell from the intro, we're also going to be talking about prayer, imagination in prayer. And I'm starting to think, you question yourself why you pick a topic. And I think ultimately, and this is a confession at the beginning of the podcast, that I must feel when I go to my synagogue that I am not getting this type of nurturing, the type of stimulation that I want. I find that prayer in the typical American synagogue is grossly wanting. And I think that is the only way I can explain why when I read a parsha, I focus on something that has to do with prayer. So that's my confession to you. Do you ever feel that your prayer needs a recharge, a reboot? You pray a lot more than me.
There's no question that's right. Yes, I think that prayer needs, a recharge, a reboot, rethinking, reimagining. I think that's a great term to use, imagination. We need to think about it a little bit.
Well, great. So in Genesis 48:11, as I said, it says, and Israel, and of course we know that is Jacob, who had a name change after wrestling with an angel. And Israel said to Joseph, I never thought to see you again. And here God has let me see your children as well. So he's looking at his son Joseph, who was sold as a slave, but his kids told him that he had been torn to pieces and died. And here he is seeing that son with grandchildren to boot. And he goes, and this is the translation, lo palalti, I never thought. Another translation that you see is I never expected. So we have thinking and expectation. But as I said in the introduction, palalti comes from the same root as lehitpalel, to pray. And that we have come across previous times in Genesis. In Genesis 20, it says, therefore, restore the man's life since he is a prophet. He will intercede for you. After Abraham pimps off Sarah as his wife, and then the Pharaoh gets leprosy, and he says, why did you do this to me? Abraham says, I will pray for you. I will intercede is the translation. In Genesis 20:17, it says, Abraham then prayed to God, and God healed Avimelech. Interesting that both of these references are to a prayer of healing. But nonetheless, lehitpalel is typically taken as something that means to pray. If you look at your typical concordance in my sheet notes, the Sephira notes that go along with this podcast and are posted on this Clubhouse, it talks about, it's a primitive word that means to pray, to entreat, judgment, prayer, supplication, and finally, one time, it means thought. So in our Parsha, it is seemingly a very unique angle, a very unique way of taking this word to palal. What do you think, Rabbi? Is it thought? Is it expected? Or is it something else?
I mean, both of those are good. And of course, the question is how it relates to prayer, lehitpalel. And the amazing thing about the word lehitpalel in grammar is called a reflexive, meaning it reflects back on you. So prayer really means to think about yourself or to imagine yourself, right? And I think that's really interesting. By the way, the same word, palilut, is used later in the Torah at the end of the book of Devarim. It means to judge. To think and to judge is the same thing. But it's an interesting idea that prayer might be that we judge ourselves.
So I think there's almost universal consensus that in lahit palel, whatever palel means, the fact that it's reflexive is fascinating. And that really relates to what does it mean? Because whatever it means, you're almost doubling over. You're doing upon yourself. So I'm going to quote a few classical commentaries as we explore what it does mean or what it could mean. So the Chizkuni, he talks about, he's obviously troubled by the fact that if this means something different than elsewhere, it means, how does it relate to prayer? So he says it means he had not even prayed to see Joseph again. And a few commentaries say there is this concept in halacha, in Jewish law, that you can't make a bracha levatala. You can't make a prayer, especially one that uses God's name, if you don't have a justification to say it. In other podcasts, we've talked about just the idea of praying. You need permission. You almost need God to tell you, I give you permission to pray. But you can't make a prayer over fruit if you're not going to bite into and eat the fruit. And so according to the Chizkuni, because he's struggling to connect it to prayer, is that this was so far from my mind, from reality, that I didn't even permit myself to pray because I didn't feel that there was any positive outcome that could happen. And that's how he kind of relates it to this other concept of it hadn't entered my thought or it hadn't entered my imagination. But I think he's struggling with it. Do you agree?
I agree. I mean, it's not clear exactly what it means. It's the reason that you picked it out, it's a funny use of the word in the context in this week's parsha. It's not the word you would expect, and that's why it's something that's worth talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, like the Ibn Ezra says, and again, this is in line with what you were saying. He says it comes from the same root as palilim, judges. And he says, so in a sense, my mind never judged that I would ever see you. So we have now two commentaries who are trying somehow to link it to the traditional term of either prayer, it wouldn't enter my name to make the prayer, or to judge. I would never have judged rationally that this would be the case. Again, the Radak, very similar to what I said before, says that he was afraid, that he was saying that he had not prayed to God concerning being reunited with Joseph in this life, as he had not considered it as forbidden vain prayer. He was afraid of praying in vain. And that's a fascinating concept as well, this concept of praying in vain. How does that strike you? It kind of
That's a great concept, praying in vain, because we generally feel that prayer is always good. Praying in vain, the Talmud has a great thing. The Talmud says if a woman who's pregnant, it doesn't pay to pray whether that it's going to be a boy or a girl, because it either is a boy or a girl or not. Your prayers are not going to change anything. So a prayer in vain means a prayer to change something that is already reality.
I mean, but if you think in terms of kind of the audacity of prayer, the question of what sort of a prayer is a prayer in vain. And I think it's pretty obvious when it comes to the example that I gave before, which is when you make a blessing over doing something and you don't do it. But here, you kind of wonder, and I think this might touch on the crux of the issue here. Can we not pray for the impossible? Can we not pray for something that is not totally rational? And I think that's kind of what they're also struggling with, where what is this prayer that Joseph says he didn't dare to make? I think when we go to Rashi, and usually I start with Rashi, but I think that Rashi is so much on the money here, I left him for last. And of course, all the other commentaries saw Rashi first. Rashi says, I had never dared to cherish the thought that I would again see his face. Lo milani libi lachashov machshava. Lachashov machshava, to think a thought. He says paliti is an expression for thinking. So now we've had paliti is for prayer, politing is for judging, and now with Rashi, we're starting to come for prayer is just to think. And I would dare say, imagine. Because what he's really saying is that I couldn't bring myself. I had given up. I had been mayayesh on ever seeing my son, let alone grandchildren, that I wouldn't dare. This is a whole new level.
That's a whole new level. That is absolutely a whole new level. That he admits that he had given up hope from ever seeing them again is a very personal statement, right? I mean, and it's a statement of thanksgiving to God. Like, I can't imagine this happen, and look what just happened.
So before we follow up a little bit on what Rashi has instituted here, that palalti is not necessarily judging, which is certainly a form of thinking, and it's definitely not praying. It's just it hadn't entered my thought or my imagination. What I did is I pulled out all my books on my shelf for kind of, I guess, I'm kind of a prayer aficionado. I have Eli Munk's book on prayer. I have Donin's book, Chaim Donin, To Pray as a Jew. The first thing that I realized is so much of the books on Jewish prayer have to do less with prayer and more on the Siddur. Less with prayer and more on prayers. And that was each of them, and I've quoted Donin in my notes. I've also quoted some other sources. They all seem to be focused on our prayers, on the Siddur, on particular prayers. And a few weeks ago we did Nishmat Kol Chai. There were some amazing prayers. But the actual concept of praying, there's typically one paragraph that addresses the issue that we're discussing. And almost universally, it focuses on the fact that lahit palel is reflexive, and it means to most of them say it means to judge oneself. Introspection. If you followed most of these books, you would assume that Jewish prayer is all about introspection. That's certainly a part of it. And of course, we have to say that in the rabbinic tradition, tefillah is generic prayer, but it's more specifically the silent prayer, the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the 18 benedictions. Am I right there?
You are definitely right there.
And so how does that strike you, that prayer is about introspection? Is that an aspect of it, or do you think that's the whole story?
When you jump to the idea that it's the 18 benedictions, what we call in Hebrew the Amidah, I think that's a term they use in English too. You have to understand something. Prayer didn't start off that way. Prayer started off that everybody prayed their own prayer. It was only because, Maimonides says, it was only because people lost the ability to articulate their feelings in words that the rabbis instituted a standard prayer. So when you talk about what prayer is, it's hard to say that prayer is, the 18 benedictions, because actually that's too rigid. Prayer is much beyond that. It's just that when people stopped being able to express themselves, they started expressing it through the 18 benedictions. I think it's much better to say that prayer is the way that we kind of, you'd say introspection, that we kind of imagine ourselves standing before God. And what does that mean about us? And what does that mean about our relationship with God?
So I totally agree. I did a Google search for prayer, Jewish prayer, and imagining, and I came up with one hit. It was How to Pray Well by Rabbi David Rosenfeld. And he literally quotes our pasuk. And he says the word Jacob uses for imagine is pileti, of the same root as the word hitpalel. Prayer is thus not only asking God for something, it is imagining becoming whom I'd like to become. So he kind of combines the concept of imagining with this reflexology that we've been talking about. So it's imagining about myself. Prayer is envisioning myself becoming a greater person and asking God for the divine assistance to help me get there. Now, I totally agree. On the one hand, I have to say that I was surprised how few people that talked about Lehit Palel quoted our verse and understood that our verse was saying something slightly differently. I love what he says. The only criticism that I would have is if you put it back into context. This was not a prayer about Jacob or Israel envisioning himself becoming a greater person. This was Jacob, an Israel, saying, I never imagined. My daughter married a guy whose grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And I went back, the first time I met her, she says, I've taken every one of my grandchildren to Auschwitz. And I said, if you ever go, please take me. And she was in her 90s, and she says, I'm going. My kids weren't even married then. We went with her. She went on a trip of survivors from a single town in Poland. I never knew this. Every town has a group of people all around the world, survivors and now more and more children of survivors, who stick together. So not only was my wife and I the only people who were not related to a survivor, we were the only people not related to this town. And she goes into Auschwitz, and her grandchild got his guitar inside. They said no musical instruments. He said this is going to be an exception. And he played on imamin. And then she spoke, and she says the only thing that kept me alive was that I one day, and I have no justification for why, I imagined that there might be you, that there might be children and grandchildren. And this is exactly what what Israel is doing right now. He's saying,
that's an amazing story.
It came to my mind when I read
about, oh my God,
about Jacob looking at his son and his grandchildren and
it's
saying,
exactly the
I
same
never
story.
Imagined. I never
if
imagined.
If she knew how to say a Dvar Torah, she would have said this Dvar Torah, because she's saying exactly what Jacob said.
Trust me, she knew. But in any case, that doesn't come out here. I would like to pursue a little bit further this concept of imagining, but not an imagination that is necessarily introspective, not an imagination that says, oh, if I could become a better person, because that wasn't the imagination she was talking about in Auschwitz. It was an imagination of just call it a leap of faith, call it believing in something that's not rational, that has no basis but gives you hope. That's the type of imagination I think that Jacob and Israel was talking about. And that's the type of imagination I'd like to pursue in terms of prayer. Are you with me?
I'm with you. Let's go.
So I want to start with, we're going to talk to the Maharal. I don't think I've ever quoted the Maharal on the Matli podcast. But the Maharal reads Isaiah. And Isaiah 56 says, I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. And the Hebrew for house of prayer is bebeit tefilati. So now we have an additional problem. Now we have, not only do we not totally understand what prayer is, but we've got to understand what God's prayer is. Because it says bebeit tefilati, as though it was, if I was Orthodox, I would say kiviyachol, God's prayer. And so then you have classic rabbinic texts asking, whence do we know that the Holy One, praised be He, prays? Minayin she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitpalel. And one lesson that the Ein Yaakov brings, that from here we learn that amazing Hasidic lesson, that prayers from the mouth of babes, prayers from pure, those are as valuable as any other prayers, because ultimately they are the prayers of God. And that is one of the lessons that is quoted in the Ein Yaakov, which brings down Berachot. And there are others that ask the same question of how is it that God can pray? And this is when we get to the Maharal in his book called the Ber HaGolah. And it's where he is defending and exploring what Judaism is. And he says that the key is prayer, palal shulashon machshava. Prayer is a language of thought. So what unites the previous interpretations of prayer is to judge, prayer is to hitpalel, is to pray. He says it all comes from a lashon of machshava. And he says that God is as much a thinker as we are. You could even say, and he adds one additional thing. He says that it is machshava combined with language. It is audible machshava, if you will. And for those of us, it's important. We're finishing the book of Genesis today. We have to remember how the world was created. It was created by God thinking and God saying. So it's almost creating reality. So in a sense, the interpretation of Palel to be machshava, to be imagine it comes back to what Herzl says. If you can imagine it, it is no dream. It will be. It is almost an exercise in realizing one's thoughts. And that we can understand as something that is both divine and potentially human.
That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. The idea that prayer is recognizing your own thoughts. Not that you're thinking about yourself, but that you recognize what your thoughts are about yourself, about religion, about how you get along with other people. But it's recognizing those thoughts. That's great. That's a great Maharal. Thank you.
And of course, the Maharal is trying to have us say that when we pray to God, we are trying to get his prayer to be one of Meshurat Lifnim Meshurat Hadin, that he should move from the side of strict justice to the side of mercy and grace. So in a sense, when we pray, we're praying for our minds, and we're enunciating it, and we're hoping that God will pray and enunciate in a similar fashion. There's this kind of reflexivity, which I think is captured in the word lahitpalel. But it really started me thinking about what I find most inspiring in synagogue. When I think back to the times that I have prayed the best, it's when I've heard a rabbi give a drasha that inspires me, and it's typically right in front of maybe Musaf, and you hear this drasha, this sermon, and it inspires the way you think, and then you move it into prayer. It reminds me of before a yoga class or a meditation, where the leader will give you an intention, will kind of stroke your imagination. Today it's cold out, let's think of this. Today this has happened in the world, think of this. And it reminded me of the Mishnah in Barachot that says that in the earlier times, the rabbis would spend an hour before they actually prayed, so they would focus their hearts toward their Father in heaven. And it's always translated as kavanah, which is intentionality. But I'm starting to think in terms of our imagination, it's an intention that when we pray, we need to be thinking, imagining something. That's how I took it this week.
And what do you think? Do you think it matters what we imagine, or it's the experience of allowing ourselves to imagine whatever we imagine?
What dawned on me is that the struggle that we Jews have, that is represented in all the books that I described, that talk about the Siddur, the set prayers, is that the prayers stay the same, but the intentions can be totally different. And I imagine these rabbis an hour before prayers fixing their intentions for that day. And I think based on one's intentions, the same prayer can be 360 degrees different. That's what kind of it struck me as.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really sophisticated point. That prayer means something different depending on where you are. That's why the institution of the Amidah actually makes prayer less than it really is, right?
Yes and no. Yes and no. It's kind of like a Rorschach test. What do you see in it today? What does that tell me about you? But I really felt that this hour before prayer, establishing one's intention, was a game changer. And it even reflects upon a little bit of the body language. At the end of that Mishnah in Barachot, it says, you have to focus your hearts towards the Father in heaven. And if the king greets him, he should not respond to him. And even if a snake is wrapped on his heel, he should not interrupt. There's almost that you move, though you take those 3 steps forward and you're in a different space. Your mind is in a different space. So
it's so funny. You talk about the 3 steps forward. In the introduction to the Art Scroll Siddur, Rabbi Saul Berman, you talked about Rabbi Riskin, Rabbi Saul Berman, who was the successor of Rabbi Riskin in Lincoln Square Synagogue. He wrote the introduction to the Art Scroll Siddur. And he says that the most important part of the Amidah is the 3 steps forward. You're supposed to take 3 steps into your own world. It's a different world. That's really a great idea, I thought.
That's totally amazing. So here's what I did. I Googled imagination and prayer, and I came up with Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuits. And there is a whole practice based on him. It's in the source notes, but I am going to read you 7 examples and 7 ways he believes that you can use imagination in prayer. So he says, imagine the sights and sounds of a biblical story, either as an observant or as a participant in the scene. So the first is exactly kind of what I was discussing before when you hear a great sermon and he's talking about feeding the hungry. That colors the way you read. So think of a biblical story. He says, 2, take inspiration from an object that sparks your imagination. Focus on something. Have a conversation with God is number 3. That kind of reminded me of the Breslovers, but definitely reminded me of this taking 3 steps forward as a sign of kind of meeting with God. Here's a cool one. 4, imagine another person's point of view. Ignatius suggests that we always try to put a good interpret on another person's actions. Can you imagine trying to step into somebody else's mind as the reflexivity of Lehit Palel? Then he talks about giving thanks. Bring to mind a series of pictures of people, relationships, communities, pets, or others for whom you are grateful. He really focused on just this sense of what Jacob, Israel said he could not do. I couldn't imagine it. And he's saying when you pray, try to just imagine somebody and it'll change your praise for the day. Then he goes, remember the tzaddikim. He says saints. But remember the tzaddikim. Think of great people. The last, he says, let go of old images of God and allow new ones to emerge. I mean, you talk about trying to expand our horizons with prayer. This absolutely just blew me away that here was a religious thinker that focused on combining imagination with prayer and what happens when you do that.
That's fantastic. That's a great way to end the whole thing. And it's great that we started with Jacob. Jacob says, he uses the same word for prayer to mean imagine or think or contemplate or judge or whatever it is. And what we did is we showed how that same idea, that same use of the word has kind of worked through the ages, and that the prayer that we have today, and like you said, the sermon or the drasha that we have today, the Dvar Torah before Musaf, that allows us to reflect a little bit better is really the same experience that Jacob had, which is really beautiful. So, when we finish Vayechi, we finish the book of Breshit, we worked really hard on it all the way since Simchas Torah. We say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. We should be strong, and we should strengthen one another. And we look forward to moving ahead. The book of Shemot, it's a whole different book, Geoffrey. No more family. Now it's all about the nation building. Next Thursday, I will be in transit, but Geoffrey has some treats and surprises for everybody. So enjoy. I look forward to catching up when I land. Shabbat Shalom, and enjoy the last parsha of the book of Rishon.
Shabbat Shalom, Rabbi. And I just want to finish, because in the pregame I said I was going to mention Harry Weston Wolfson.
Let's hear.
I was reading a book, an essay that he wrote called Escaping Judaism. And in it, he says many amazing things. You can look in the source sheet. But he talks about our prayers. And he is not a religious Jew. He is a graduate of Slobodka. He is the most knowledgeable Jew in the ideas and the history of ideas in Judaism. And he criticizes Reform Jews of his time for changing the prayer book. And he says, do you not think that when Maimonides read about Machaye HaMetim, about bringing the dead back to life, and he had a more sophisticated view of it, that he did not find it offensive? But, and here's where he talks about imagination. He says, if you just change the word, where is the imagination? He calls them cowards. He says, pray from a prayer book that has been written and stood the test of 2,000 years, and challenge your imagination to find new meaning in it. And that just blew me away. So with
That is beautiful.
So with that, Genesis, if anything, is imagination. We've finished the book. Rabbi, it's been an absolute pleasure to do it with you. I wish you a Nasiya Tuvah.
You too, and we look forward to doing it from the other side of the world a week from now.
Shabbat
Be well 2
shalom
weeks
to
from now.
everyone.
Shabbat shalom. Enjoy.
Thank you. And next time we speak, next Thursday, I hope to be in the Holy Land of Israel. And either I will do it alone or I will find somebody in Israel who wants to do it with me. But in the meantime, enjoy the last parsha, the last portion of Bereshit. Shabbat shalom to you all.